in Australia around 2005. A whole generation of teachers that hadn't received adequate training at university to understand how children learn to read. And so we had a generation there where they needed a lot of upskilling.
You're listening to Around the School Table, hosted by me, Steve Davis, and proudly powered by Xuno Suite. We'll be bringing together the many voices shaping primary and secondary education across Australia, from principals and teachers to education thought leaders and system innovators. Whether you're in the classroom, the staff room, or the boardroom, this is your podcast to be informed, inspired, and connected. Learning at SPELD SA, a leading literacy support organisation with nearly 20 years' experience bridging research and classroom practice. Kerry champions tools like DIBELS to move beyond the wait to fail model, helping teachers identify and support struggling readers early through precise evidence-based assessment. And in the chat we're about to have, she'll be unpacking the slow shift to structured literacy. Despite decades of research, the role of experts like Sarah McDonough and communities like DIBELS in Oz, and practical intervention strategies that work regardless of diagnosis. So if you're an educator and you're committed to literacy, equity, and closing the evidence practice gap, I think Kerry's insights we're about to get will be both urgent and actionable. Kerry, welcome to Around the School Table.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me on.
Kerry, you've spent nearly a decade at SPELD SA, and your journey began as an English and history teacher back in 2004. The role you've got now at SPELD SA spans everything from professional learning workshops to developing decodable readers, overseeing tutoring services as well. That's a pretty broad lens on literacy. So, to get underway, could you elaborate on how these different responsibilities connect and also what they reveal about where schools are getting it right and where they're struggling?
Okay. It is a broad role, but SPELD SA is a pretty small not-for-profit organisation. So most of our staff are across different areas of the organisation. So they all connect because they're all useful tools that we're developing and training and support for students with learning difficulties particularly. But what we know is that the types of instruction and practices and resources that we need for supporting students with learning difficulties are the same strategies and things that we use for all students. It's just best practice approaches to teaching literacy. So we provide, of course, training to educators in the area of DIBELS, but also in understanding learning difficulties like dyslexia. We train in synthetic phonics approaches to teaching literacy, which we know is the best practice approach to early literacy. So all sorts of things like that. We have our tutors that support students in the community that are registered with us, that have appropriate skills and training. And, of course, we're constantly trying to develop resources and making them freely available so that those evidence-based resources that are needed are freely available.
And I note, you said SPELD SA is small, and that's why you're involved in all different aspects of it. I mean, we mentioned before, I started in radio, and in country radio, you do everything, and it gives you that oversight into all different areas, so you're more useful out in the world. But so from that perspective, just at a first glance, we'll go deeper in this later, but what are you seeing across the board? Where are schools generally getting it right in this realm, and where are they struggling? What's your off-the-cuff first impressions?
I think schools are currently doing a great job moving towards evidence-based best practice approaches to teaching reading. We're seeing a really large-scale shift, which is so positive. And we're seeing departments for education across Australia getting on board as well, and really trying to get teachers upskilled into evidence-based practice. So that's really positive. The other thing, though, we do see is a little bit of a hangover from our past approaches to teaching literacy that were not necessarily evidence-based, because we've been through an era where we believe there was a belief that children would learn to read just through exposure to books, and that's been completely debunked by multiple large-scale studies now, and so we know now how to teach reading effectively, but there are still some myths prevailing and some classroom practices that have sort of made their way still into classrooms. So there is still some work to do, and yes, there's still some myths around a lot of this area.
I will just say, you've just triggered a couple of thoughts for me before we go back onto the straight and narrow, and it is about that. The passion and the curiosity to understand the world, through which reading literacy is part of that. And it just reminded me, in year 4, my daughter had to learn a poem by rote. That was part of the exercises, which involved reading and learning. And she said, what would I do? And I said, well, I'd do Puck's epilogue from Midsummer Night's Dream. Her teacher almost had a heart attack. She said, you don't do that till high school, but she did it anyway. And I think there was just a little bit of obviously care that she might have been biting off more than she can chew, but I still reflect on whether that first reaction was going to quench this little girl being brave enough to push forward. Where does that fit in your world, that mindset here? Because I know we've got the evidence-based approach we're doing. There's something about that raw passion of curiosity and exploration that I feel needs to be nurtured as we move through life.
Absolutely. There's an excellent saying getting around the science of reading community that nothing kills enthusiasm for literature more than not being able to read. So I think as a basis, children need to have strong skills, basic skills, foundation skills in reading, which involves good phonemic awareness or awareness of sounds, connecting those sounds to spellings, being able to blend and segment words. So all that base foundation phonics knowledge is critical for children to then be competent, accurate readers, and then to explore books broadly, to access all that rich vocab in books, and to access all that rich vocab and wonderful storytelling in the early years. We just encourage that families and educators are reading to children from more complex code. And we talk about in our world of teaching reading that it's critical that students have access to decodable text when they're learning to read, but they're really like training wheels when you're learning to ride a bike. So we don't want kids stuck on decodable readers for their whole lives. Of course, we want them to explore a range of interesting texts and build up their vocab and their understanding of text structure and all those things that build into being a truly comprehending reader. And of course, children in the early years taught well will transition off these decodable texts effortlessly.
I don't feel so guilty now. I want to touch base on DIBELS because you've been closely involved in supporting teachers through tools like that. You've even made some instructional videos which are used nationally, I should point out. For someone listening who might be a little bit unfamiliar, can you unpack what DIBELS actually measures and why it's been such a game changer compared to what came before it?
Yes. So DIBELS it stands for Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. It was developed at the University of Oregon in the US, and it's aligned with the 5 big ideas in reading that came out of the National Reading Panel, that was commissioned in the US in the late 90s. And the National Reading Panel released a report, and that what they did was they brought together all the research into how children learn to read, but not just from fields of education. They looked at, psychology, cognitive neuroscience, all those academic areas that were involved in how children learn and how they learn to read particularly. And they came up with these 5 big ideas in reading. Those are, I'll list them.
Yep.
So we've got as a basis phonological awareness and more specifically phonemic awareness or awareness of sounds in our language. phonics or alphabetic principle, attaching sounds to spellings. We need to build that up to high accuracy and fluency. Vocabulary, so having a good, strong, solid vocab, and then, of course, our end goal is comprehension, readers that can comprehend the text that they're reading. So the DIBELS measures, there's 6 different subtests that are provided through DIBELS, and each of those is aligned with those specific skills that children need to develop to become a skilled and competent reader. And what that does, firstly, it enables us to target risk really early, which previous measures have not necessarily picked up poor readers in those first couple of years of school. And we really did, the methods we were using, children could kind of guess their way through and appear to be reading, but they weren't behind that. They weren't developing the specific skills they needed to become strong readers. So DIBELS allows us to drill down into those specific skills, and that also allows us to target precisely where that child is struggling. So when we're putting intervention in place, we're not wasting our time on interventions that are not targeting what they need next. It's an evidence-based screener that just allows us to do our jobs better is the key.
Yes, and I don't know if you saw my facial expressions, but as you were going through that, I just had memories of Mrs. Tucker, my teacher in, was it grade 3? We had the Endeavour reading series of books that you had to self-pace and I sort of skipped ahead. And one day she caught me out and I had to go back and do them all again. But I guess that's what you're talking about, having a system where you can be more vigilant that the work is being done.
Making sure that children are progressing as they should. DIBELS, I should have mentioned, DIBELS is a normed and standardised measure, so it's been normed on thousands of students in the US.
Yeah.
The materials have been modified for the Australian context, but it allows us to clearly see, are our students meeting expected benchmarks at this stage in their learning to read journey? So it picks up risk very early and allows us to act. Yeah, absolutely.
And look, just to keep you really relaxed here in this interview, I'm going to throw one other question you're not expecting at you. The phonetics aspect of this learning, when we're dealing with English, boy, it throws some doozies at you. If you had the chance to have a new child be born in a culture anywhere on earth, what language would give them the easiest road that you understand? Or is it useful starting with a tough one like English because it sets you up to deal with others?
Oh, my goodness. What a great question. I work with a lot of students with learning difficulties. So if I could have my pick, I'd pick a much simpler language. I'm not a linguist, but I believe that Spanish, and I don't speak Spanish, but I believe that in Spanish there's less than 30, might be 24 or something, sounds in their language, and around 30 ways to spell those sounds. So it takes about 3 months, apparently, to learn to read and spell in Spanish, whereas English, being such a very complex writing system, it takes 3 years and lots of practice. We've got 44 sounds, and then we've got 175 common ways to spell the 44 sounds. Then there's probably another 100 or so less common ways to spell those sounds. So very complex. And, of course, English is a morphophonemic language, so it's a very it's complex in that way too. It relies on phonics knowledge, but also a bit of knowledge around morphology and etymology, and it gets quite complex when you really look at it.
And then, of course, you've got
Spanish. I pick Spanish.
Yes. And then you've got the hierarchy where you've got the South Australian pronunciation, which is correct, and then all the other variations around Australia. You don't need to comment on that.
Still juggling forms the old-fashioned way? Say hello to Student Forms by Xuno. You can create, collect, and manage all your student forms online in one simple, secure platform. Save time, stay organised, and quick access everything you need, anytime. Visit xuno.com.au and see how Student Forms by Xuno can work for your school.
Kerry, before DIBELS, I've heard you describe education assessment as operating on a wait for fail model, often relying on running records that encourage guessing rather than decoding. What did that look like in practice, and why do you think it was so misaligned with how children actually learn to read?
Yeah, so the books associated with running records were highly predictable books, and they were purposefully designed that way. So the idea was that if children could just guess their way through a book, that they got the idea that you read left to right across the page, and they were very repetitive texts. So usually the child would have that text read to them first in those early stages. They'd get the pattern and then they'd read the book, and it would contain very complex words with very complex code. So to work out that word, instead of decoding it or using their word reading skills, the child would either look at the picture, have a guess. They might look at the next word on, or look at the first sound, have a guess. So a lot of guessing was involved. So what that meant for students is that they could appear to be reading in those early years, but they weren't acquiring those skills. And we know now that those books actually work against what we're trying to achieve. So they actually undermine the development of good, strong phonics skills and understanding that we need to become a competent reader. And so what they did was they'd look like they were reading, then they'd sort of run out of visual memory, not be able to guess anymore because the books were getting a bit more complex, and then suddenly we had a dive in reading. And during that time, actually in the late 90s, reading outcomes for school leavers was really alarming. So in Australia, it was reported by the Bureau of Statistics that we had around just over 40% functionally illiterate students leaving high school, and in the US, in California, actually up around the 60% functionally illiterate. So it was seen as being a literacy crisis, and that's why these really, national inquiries were put in place at that time in the US in the late 90s, and in Australia around 2005 they released their national inquiry into literacy. So there was an urgent need to do something differently. But at the time, there was pushback, of course, because publishing companies that were making big profits out of these books and out of these methodologies had a lot to lose through this. So there was a bit of pushback and resistance. And also there was just a whole generation of teachers that hadn't received adequate training at university to understand how children learn to read. And so we had a generation there where they needed a lot of upskilling. And in South Australia, of course, the government implemented the Literacy Guarantee Unit, which has made huge strides forward in sending coaches out to schools and upskilling those teachers that hadn't received that training. And I guess also important to note is that phonics instruction actually did predate this whole language approach to teaching literacy. So there were some teachers, some of the teachers that have been around a bit longer would have received some training around explicitly teaching reading. And then in came this idea that actually that's a bit dated and boring, and if we just immerse children in books and help to instill a love of literature, then they'll just get it. But one of the things I compare this to is maths. So we know that maths needs explicit instruction, and we wouldn't give kids sheets of algebraic equations and lots of answers to them and I expect them to just kind of pick up number and maths. We kind of always knew that we needed to start with small, easy to access information around maths, basic numbers to 10, basic addition, work up to, subtraction, numbers to 100, and then we gradually increase the complexity of the maths. And our writing system is, I would say, just as complex as mathematics, and it needs explicit instruction in a really carefully scaffolded, systematic way.
Yeah, that's also why my year 4 daughter's teacher didn't like it when for maths I said she'll solve the Riemann hypothesis, but that's a different matter for a different day. But here's the thing I was going to ask you, because I think I love the maths analogy, because we had new maths come through at some point in the 70s and you changing factors and all sorts of things. But that gap between evidence and practice, was it just that slight delay in picking this up and the pushback? Was it just fear of the unknown and we're stuck and we've got all those vested interests? Was there something else causing that friction, that delay?
I think the work, I work with teachers a lot, educators, and I think they all are passionate about doing the best by their students. They all want to use best practice approaches, but it was just a lack of understanding, and there still is a lack of that knowledge base out there, because it is quite complex, the teaching of literacy, and without some professional development around it, it's not something that teachers are necessarily going to understand why they need to change. But they certainly are now. I think lots and lots of schools, probably the vast majority of schools actually, have invested in training around the science of reading and evidence-based practice. Most schools that I'm seeing now have implemented a synthetic phonics approach to teaching literacy. It's quite rare to come across schools now that aren't, but they're still out there. But there's still a lot of misinformation. Like, I ran a dyslexia workshop yesterday, actually, and there was still questions around things like coloured overlays and coloured papers and things, special fonts for students with learning difficulties, and those sorts of things have been completely debunked by the research. So, it's another myth that dyslexia is a visual problem and that it can be fixed with a different coloured page. And that's absolutely not the case. So it just takes time for educators to be upskilled in best practice.
I want to come back to dyslexia in just 2 seconds, but just before we leave DIBELS fully, there are experts. I mentioned Sarah McDonough at the beginning, who actually trained at the University of Oregon. So that's ground zero for all of this.
It is, yeah.
There's also a group, I believe, a Facebook group called DIBELS in Oz. For someone listening, a teacher who is curious to get involved in this more, can you walk us through the resources that are available, how you might access them and make use of them?
Yeah, so DIBELS in Oz is a great Australian group full of educators, and Sarah McDonough's in there as well. But so just questions and answers about using DIBELS. So it's a really useful, and it's a very busy and, vibrant Facebook group if you happen to be on Facebook. They also have in their files section, lots of people have generously spent hours developing spreadsheets and things for recording data, and they've put them in there to use. The DIBELS measures themselves are free to access. So you can just Google DIBELS University of Oregon and up they will come, and you can access all the materials, the benchmarking materials that are administered 3 times a year. And also, in addition, there's progress monitoring forms in there as well for each year level up to year 8. So everything's freely available. We do recommend training just because it is a normed and standardised measure. So if you can attend training, that's highly recommended to make sure that the data that you are collecting is valid and that you're able to interpret the data appropriately to really get the most out of it, I guess. So we highly recommend the 2-day courses with Sarah McDonough because she, is probably, Australia's expert in this field. She's got a PhD. And she is a literacy consultant. So she's very. I don't think there'd be anything she wouldn't know about using DIBELS and also about implementing evidence-based instruction as well and intervention.
Do you take part in DIBELS in Oz yourself on the Facebook group? Are you there often?
I'm more of an observer, but yes, I'm in it. I'm very, very uncommon for me to put something on Facebook.
Well, I'm just wonder, in that particular group where you've got teachers, you're dealing with literacy, do people pick each other up on their grammar like other Facebook groups?
No, that's the English Teachers Association.
Okay. Actually, there's one other aspect of support. I believe there's a hotline, 1-800-371-085, which is an advisory support for educators and families here in South Australia, but around Australia. What are some of the common questions, misconceptions you're hearing, and how widely available? Who is this for?
Oh, this is for anybody who wants to call and talk to us. So the advisory line at SPELD is manned by teachers with a special ed background or inclusive education, including myself and some of my colleagues. And that's available Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. until 1 p.m. So we get lots of calls from parents who have concerns about their children and they're wanting to talk about how they can support their child at home. We get calls from educators around resources, appropriate resources for the programs and things that they have in place at their schools. They might be calling us to talk about workshops that we have and figuring out whether they're appropriate for what their staff need. We get calls around assessments with psychologists and anything really, anything and everything that's related to supporting students with learning difficulties, but also supporting classrooms with evidence-based practices.
On the support front, you've made a PowerPoint, I've been told, of something like, it doesn't matter why a child is struggling, what matters is that we act. Can you unpack what you mean by that? Perhaps share what effective early intervention actually looks like in a school setting?
Yeah, so it's, I guess the message behind that is that it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is if a child is behind their peers in reading. So the intervention is the same. The why doesn't, it matters, but it doesn't matter as far as what we need to do next. And often we talk to parents about that are interested in booking an assessment to get a diagnosis for their child under the belief that they'll then get extra support from the school, but that isn't always the case. So what we say to schools as well is that and is the case in most schools, what matters for identifying students that need intervention is not whether they have a diagnosis, but whether they are showing risk. So that's the most important thing, that they're putting that extra practice and repetition in. We know for students with learning difficulties that it's about dosage, not doing something different. So we came from an era where we'd say, well, that whole class program isn't working for that child, so we're going to put them in this other program that's different. And then, they'd say that doesn't work for that child, so let's try something else. So there was a lot of switching out programs for these students, and what that was doing was just adding extra cognitive load for these students that were most at risk. So what we know is, as long as we've got a really good, high quality program in place in the classroom and it's being taught with fidelity by teachers that are trained in using it, then we up the dosage for those students that have fallen behind. So we just give them extra, usually in a small group intervention setting, extra opportunities to practice, extra repetition, working with the skills needed to become a good reader. Yep. And then, of course, some students need even more. So those students might be identified for working with a speech pathologist, or sometimes a parent will get a private tutor for their child to give them that extra dosage on top.
All right, Kerry.
Did that answer the question?
Yes. Wow. More than I anticipated.
Okay, great.
Just before we finish, you mentioned some of the myths still out there in regards to working with students with dyslexia. But before we finish, I want to give you a chance to expand some more thoughts on that, because you have noted there is a gap often between students' needs and what schools are resourced to provide, as well as financial barriers to diagnosis, let alone. What's the equity issue happening here? What change do you think needs to happen to support families and schools, their ability to pay and support these students?
Oh, gosh. In a perfect world,
Yes.
these students would get as much, intervention and support as they need. So what we're seeing, and it's frustrating for families, but it's also frustrating for schools because, of course, they don't want their students to be lagging well behind their peers. But we have often schools can provide that sort of tier 2 intervention, but we talk to lots of parents whose child has been excluded from that because they're not considered sort of severe enough. So they're kind of left to, flail in the classroom. So we've still got a lot of students with learning difficulties that are slipping, under the cracks, that are progressing their way through school, lagging behind and failing regularly. And that's feeding into, high anxiety, school refusal. So I think there really isn't across the board enough support for these students that are falling behind in their literacy, particularly students with learning difficulties like dyslexia. Even a family will invest in that psychological, educational psychological assessment. That cost is around $2,000 now, and then they still can't get the support that they need in the schooling system necessarily. So some schools seem to be able to do it, but a lot don't seem to have enough adequate resources to really catch these kids up.
Very sad.
It is very sad.
Perhaps conversations like this, or just keeping awareness bubbling, might do some small thing for those who've got the hands on the levers of power.
Wouldn't that be great?
Very last stop. At the time this goes out, we're a couple of weeks away from the Dyslexia SPELD Foundation gathering, which is in Perth in early May. You're off to that. Just very briefly, what is it? What is this conference all about? What happens?
Oh, well, it's a bringing together of great minds in the area of evidence-based instruction. So researchers in broad fields from around the world. So the keynotes are, they've been brought into Australia from different areas. The focus is generally around literacy and language, but there is also a lot of speakers around numeracy and all sorts of different topics that are related to educating children in a evidence-based way. So it's just a really exciting bringing together with heaps of speakers over 3 days. This conference, so it's a big conference, and it's a very worthwhile one to go to. I'm very excited.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And I did take you off onto some weird tangents. So what I will say is, if we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear.
Beautiful.
Kerry Williams from SPELD SA, thank you for joining me around the school table.
Thanks so much, Steve.